Based on the history of France, the film introduces us to Jeanne Bernier, an illegitimate girl born of the forbidden love between a monk and an impoverished cook in the heart of the 17th century. Her destiny was meant to be spent in the shadows of the common folk, almost as if she were a daughter of nothing. But aren't the daughters of nothing ready to do anything? Her mother Anne works as a maid for Monsieur Dumas, a kind and charitable man, who took it upon himself to provide young Jeanne with a decent home and an education that matched her eagerness to learn. However, he could not claim her as his daughter, so he decided to send her to the convent of Saint Aurea to protect her from a future of debauchery, the sad reality faced by the lower classes of that era. As Jeanne grew older, life in the convent became increasingly restrictive. Fortunately, she had access to certain books that showed her what the world outside was like, including its darker corners. Through them, the young woman discovered the power of eroticism and the allure of her femininity. Eventually, the nuns caught her reading these forbidden texts, and as a result, she was expelled from the convent. Thus, Jeanne had to return to Monsieur Dumas, who welcomed her with open arms. Her stay there was brief, as Madame Dumas, fearful that her husband might succumb to Jeanne's charms, dismissed both mother and daughter under the pretext of a theft they had never committed. The two moved to Paris, where Jeanne's knowledge enabled her to find work as a reader for Madame Lagarde, a widow who lived with her two sons. The young woman soon integrated herself into the capital's aristocracy until Madame Lagarde caught her in bed with both of her sons. Once again, Jeanne had to find work elsewhere. Rather than avoiding that path, she gave herself over to debauchery, and by adulthood, she had become one of the most sought-after courtesans in the city. It was then that she met Guillaume du Barry, a count determined to win her over. Through him, Jeanne once again immersed herself in the affairs of the local aristocracy, this time without hiding her true nature. The Duke of Richelieu, captivated by her beauty and charisma, suggested to du Barry that she be presented to the king, convinced that she could entertain him. However, no one asked for Jeanne's opinion, and she was already tired of being du Barry's trophy while he satisfied his desires with other women. The only reason she hadn't left him was because of his son Adolphe, whom she had grown to love. After a party, du Barry found Jeanne reading a book when he had asked her to rest. Furious, he dunked her in a bathtub and made it clear that she would always be an ignorant prostitute no matter what dress she wore. At the count's insistence, Jeanne was presented at the court of King Louis XV, who turned out to be even more handsome than she had imagined. He looked at her in a way that no other woman had for a long time. In no time at all, Louis sent Laborde, his best servant, to fetch Jeanne from her home, along with some coins as compensation to du Barry for the trouble. The king had chosen his new courtesan and awaited her in none other than his own home, the majestic palace of Versailles. After examining her, the king's physicians deemed her suitable for him, given the number of men she had been with. The next step in the security check was Laborde, who taught her the manners and behaviors she would need in Versailles. When she asked if he would also teach her to speak, he replied that the king had no interest in listening to Harif, only he knew. When Jeanne finally set foot in Louis's bedroom, her manners crumbled, and a nervous laugh escaped her because he looked too much like a 6-franc coin. Surprisingly, the king did not take it as an insult but joined in her laughter. After examining the king's personal belongings, the courtesan sat on his lap to do what both had planned. However, it didn't seem to be a mere act of pleasure. The next day, rather than dismissing her, the king left her in a hidden room from where she could watch his routine, full of protocols and pointless ceremonies. From time to time, Louis would glance at her, silently asking for help or signaling something comical amid so much formality. Once the king's morning ritual ended, the royal family left his room walking backward, as it was forbidden to turn one's back on the king except for Jeanne, who was allowed to do so. When Louis finally freed himself, he reunited with Jeanne to give her a beautiful necklace, along with a special request. He wanted her to remain permanently in Versailles, complete with a curtsy. From then on, Jeanne secretly attended Louis's events, with Laborde as her guide. In that time she noticed the king's daughters always in plain sight, while the queen was nowhere to be seen. According to Laborde, she was a discreet woman, which was unsurprising, as she endured her husband's infidelity. There was much more to tell, but that would have to wait because the king's daughters almost caught a glimpse of their new stepmother, so to speak. After his wife's death, Louis grew even closer to Jeanne, while his daughters mourned the loss of their mother. The situation became complicated when they confronted him about the rumor that a woman of ill repute wandered the corridors of Versailles. With no other option, Louis confessed that from time to time he saw a woman, but she was married and had a son, so they needn't worry. Well, it was only half true, and his daughters knew it. Despite his family's opinion, Louis wanted to take his relationship with Yan to another level. Since she could not be accepted at court without a husband, the king convinced Du Barry to marry her in exchange for a generous sum of money. Thus, she became the Countess Du Barry, although that title mattered little to her. Instead, she focused on studying royal customs, supported by Laborde, who helped her practice the situations she would soon face. When the moment arrived, the Countess Du Barry made her grand entrance at court in a spectacular outfit that did not go unnoticed, least of all by the king. Upon seeing him, she curtsied, looking straight into his eyes, something strictly forbidden since he was the highest authority in the country. Naturally, his daughters reacted with disdain and left in outrage while he focused on the gaze of his new countess. During the event, Louis surprised Jan with an extravagant gift. My goodness, if I say what I really think, I'd probably be thrown in jail. Jokes aside, Jan enthusiastically received the Indian slave named Zamor. Together they ran through the halls and gardens of Versailles like mother and child. Thanks to the king's love, the countess introduced her taste for nature and her passion for the arts into the palace, attracting the greatest painters and poets of Paris. She became the first lady of Versailles, at least for the moment. For, in Austria, there was a certain Marie Antoinette who would soon take over Versailles as the future queen. Knowing her replacement could arrive at any moment, Jan was determined to leave an indelible mark on Versailles, and the best way to do so was to ignore all the bland customs and embrace her true charismatic and irreverent self. Meanwhile, the king granted her a mansion away from society, a place with no rules to follow. There Jan could be herself without worrying about what people might say, although, in truth, she had never really cared about that. From time to time she had to return to Versailles and face the king's annoying daughters, who scornfully referred to Zamor as a mere pet, despite the fact that she considered him her page. The only one who offered any support was Louise, the king's youngest daughter, and the most mature of the group. It was no surprise that over time, Louise decided to leave the palace and its royal privileges behind in search of a normal life, far from her sisters. Louis, who had always felt a certain fondness for her, sank into a deep depression, which led him to seek solace with women other than Jan. None of them made him feel the same as she did, but he did not give Jan the attention she deserved either. When Jan grew concerned, Laborde confirmed that the king indeed had other lovers. Although Jan was his favorite, Louis was drawn to novelty and the unknown. That didn't mean he no longer loved her, but of course, she must not even think of being unfaithful to him. Gradually, Louis recovered his zest for life and rekindled his love for Jan, ushering in the 4 happiest years for both of them at Versailles. Zamor now became an educated young man who practiced fencing with Adolphe, who had also grown up and joined the royal court. Speaking of royalty, the Dauphin, the king's grandson, and heir to the throne, finally married Marie Antoinette of Austria, making her the future queen of France and a direct opponent of the Countess Du Barry. Nevertheless, Louis made it clear at every protocol that Jan was untouchable and deserved the utmost respect. When she was presented, Marie Antoinette was captivated by the beauty and naturalness of the Countess, although the king's daughters branded her a prostitute and believed they needed to get rid of her. This sparked controversy at the table, where the men praised Jan's charisma and the women simmered with envy. Caught between a rock and a hard place, the young Marie decided to follow the advice of the royal sisters, the true shrews of this story. One day Jan was absent from a royal event because of an emergency involving Adolphe, who was wounded in a fencing duel. Sadly, there was little she could do for him other than be by his side in his final moments, along with Du Barry. After the death of her adoptive son, Jan realized that all she had left was the king's love and not even society's acceptance, since the future queen continued to ignore her. Fed up with the mockery aimed at his beloved, Louis confronted Marie Antoinette head-on to make her speak to Jan. Despite his efforts, the young woman ignored her again, influenced by her advisors, which made the king visibly furious. A single glance was enough for them to know how angry he was. After this reprimand, Marie Antoinette dared to speak to Jan for the first time, though it was a trivial remark. The countess ran to the king to share the good news. the royal family would finally deign to show her some consideration. However, fate had other plans for their love. Over time, Louis fell ill with a virulent disease that threatened to end his life. As a result, Laborde suggested Jan leave at once before the royal family forced her out, but she stood her ground. Despite the risk of infection, Jan stayed by his side until he acknowledged that his end was near. Before confessing, the priest demanded that he renounce his scandal, in other words, to renounce Jan and surrender to God and his people. Louis asked his beloved to please leave Versailles. Once everything was arranged, the Countess returned unexpectedly to bid one final farewell to the king. The royal family opposed her request, except the Dauphin, who granted her wish. Alone with Louis, Jan professed her eternal love and managed to coax one last smile out of him. Before leaving, she did not turn her back on him. Instead, she moved away with backward steps, though this time it did not provoke laughter. Finally, the Countess left the Palace of Versailles, leaving behind Zamore Laborde and her great love on his deathbed. Louis requested that Laborde always take care of Jan. That was his last wish. After the king's death, the Dauphin was proclaimed the new monarch of France, and Marie Antoinette his rightful queen. Meanwhile, Jan was sent to the convent of Saint-A, where she remained imprisoned for her sins for a year, until the new king set her free, on the condition that she never approach Versailles again. After 15 years of peace in her old home, Marie Antoinette sought her friendship amid the French Revolution. And so, Jan ended up at the guillotine, where her last words were, "One more minute, Monsieur Executioner. I have loved life too much for it to be snatched away like this."